Good afternoon and welcome to our Fall WAP Research Seminar Series. I'm Anisha Sindhi. I'm a research fellow here at the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard Kennedy School. For folks who are not familiar with our research center, WAP equips leaders and change makers with rigorous evidence-based strategies to advance women and gender equity. Before we start, we wanted to offer a virtual land acknowledgement to honor local Indigenous communities on the land where Harvard University currently sits, which is the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary unceded homeland of the Massachusetts people, the surviving descendants of the first people of Massachusetts and of the Neponset Band of the Massachusetts. The WAP team have posted a link to our land acknowledgement in the chat, and we encourage you all to explore the resources in addition to reading the statement. Our seminar this fall is focusing on how gender researchers, policymakers, and practitioners can commit to strengthening the focus on intersectional research. We will explore how gender intersects with other social identities, such as race, class, national origin, disability, parental status, and sexual orientation. Our intersectional focus will not only address the unique experiences of people with intersecting identities, but also engage with the systemic biases and oppressions that characterize these experiences. And many of the researchers we are featuring in our seminar series this semester are also featured on our Gender Action Portal, which is our online collection of experimental work that closes gender gaps. And I encourage you all to explore GAP's intersectional work at gap.hks.harvard.edu. But for today, we are thrilled to have Professor Erin Gottlieb presenting Women and Incarceration, the Need for an Intersectional Lens in Criminal Legal Reform. Professor Gottlieb is an assistant professor at the Jane Addams College of Social Work at the University of Illinois at Chicago, as well as a faculty affiliate of the Jane Addams Center for Social Policy and Research. His research is motivated by the idea that our criminal legal system is far too punitive. His scholarship examines the causes and consequences of criminal legal involvement, as well as the impact of policy and practice changes that would reduce the punitiveness of the criminal legal system. In addition to being published in a wide range of academic journals, Erin's research has also been cited in a number of media outlets, including the New York Times and the Atlantic. And in the community, Erin is active in working towards police accountability through his work on Chicago's Police Use of Force Working Group and the Empowering Communities for Public Safety Ordinance. And just before I hand it over to Erin, just want to do a few final logistics. Our speaker will present for 45 minutes, and then we will have 15 minutes for questions from our virtual audience. We ask that you hold your questions until the end of the talk. And those who have a question will have the opportunity to be unmuted and to ask your question out loud. My colleague, Katie Omberg, will be managing the Q&A portion of the seminar. So thank you so much, Katie. And thank you so much, Professor Gottlieb, for joining us today. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much for that really warm introduction, Anisha. And thanks so much for the invitation to present today. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, so the title of the talk is Women in Incarceration, the Need for an Intersectional Lens in Criminal Legal Reform. And this presentation draws on two papers that I've published with some great collaborators, including Paharita Charles, Brandon McLeod, Jean Shellstrand, and Janae Bunsu. And then also in the second presentation, the second article with Melissa Mahabir, who I want to give a particular recognition to as, her and I are actually married, and my interest in and knowledge in sort of intersectional incarceration work and the focus on women has been shaped a lot by her work as a social worker, working directly with women who are survivors of domestic violence and who have also had contact with the criminal legal system often as a result. So a lot of what I know about this topic is directly related to her experience and insights. So just to preview further, the organization of this talk, I'm going to focus first on trying to show you that we need to focus on women, which I don't think, given this audience and the topic of sort of the seminar series more generally. Should be a hard sell, but I still want to highlight that. I'm going to then present results from a study examining the impact of California's criminal legal reforms on incarceration rates overall, gender disparities in incarceration, and racial and ethnic disparities in incarceration. And then I'm going to conclude by highlighting why existing data limitations around intersectionality and incarceration are a serious issue that I hope that policymakers address. All right, so this chart right here is one that maybe you've seen before, but it highlights just how the United States stands out as the world leader in incarceration. So these numbers are rates per 100,000 people. The US, this slide is it's a little old, so the US now is down to about 650 per 100,000 people instead of 707, but it's still the world leader in incarceration. So ahead of literally every country in the world, which I know to me is pretty staggering. And when you compare us to other advanced democratic countries, so you look at countries here like, I don't know, like Canada, we're still at about 6 or 7 times the rate of those countries. And if you compare us to the Nordic countries, disparity increases to about 10 times in some cases, right? So we're really a pretty big outlier here. And what we've seen a lot is that there's been a focus, primarily when we think about incarceration, we tend to think about men and men of color. And this is understandable because if you just look at raw numbers, men are the group that is predominantly incarcerated. And that used to be how I thought too. So right now, men make up about anywhere between 85 and 90% of the people who are incarcerated in our country. But I'm going to argue that a focus on men entirely is a real limitation and an issue. So why do we need a gendered lens? So here are some of the reasons, and I'll go into each in a bit more depth moving forward. But first, women experience mass incarceration too, and directly, not just indirectly through the incarceration of men. The incarceration of women has expanded dramatically over time to even a larger extent in terms of proportions than male incarceration. Women are incarcerated for different things. Their pathways to incarceration, how they get there, are often either unique or particularly extreme. They also experience different issues behind bars and in reentry, or more extreme disadvantage. So now I'm going to go through each of those one by one. So this graph right here shows women's incarceration in the United States. That's what the green line is right there. Then it shows the next leading country, which is Thailand. And then it also treats each of the states in the United States as if they were a country. So what you can see first, if you look at the US bar, that the US does lead the world in incarceration, incarcerating 133 per 100,000 women. The next is Thailand. And Thailand's pretty close to the US, but after that, there's a dramatic drop off. But something that's really unique or important to think about when we think about US incarceration in general, but also women's incarceration, is there are huge disparities or huge heterogeneity by state. So Oklahoma, for instance, incarcerates 281 per 100,000 women, which is much higher than the national average of 133 per 100,000, right? So in some places, if we were to treat Oklahoma like its own country, it would have a higher incarceration rate than Thailand by more than double, right? So there are some places in the US where women are particularly at risk for incarceration. So second reason, in addition to women experiencing mass incarceration, is that they've experienced a dramatic growth in incarceration over time. So we often hear the stat that the US incarceration rate has quintupled over the last 40 or so years, but the women's incarceration rate has actually increased 8-fold. So when we think about mass incarceration, again, this is another reason to focus on women because it's the fastest growing demographic in prison and jail populations. And it's one that so far has been resistant to a lot of reforms, with the exception of California's, which I'll talk about later. A third reason, and this is that women are incarcerated for different things than men. And I hesitate to focus on the sort of violent, nonviolent dichotomy because how we define violence is not necessarily how the system defines violence, and also because it often leads to a situation where we only focus on nonviolent offenses and don't care about the inhumane treatment that people who've committed a violent offense experience. However, with that said, women are incarcerated disproportionately for nonviolent offenses. About 3/4 of women behind bars are incarcerated for nonviolent offenses, compared to about a little more than only 50% for men. So women are disproportionately incarcerated for nonviolent offenses. They also are disproportionately incarcerated in local jails. So roughly half of women who are incarcerated in local jails. Of that half, about 2/3 have not even been convicted of a crime. They're awaiting sentence. And when we look at men, men are also incarcerated in jails frequently, but not at nearly, but it's not nearly as common a source of incarceration, whereas about 3/4 of men are incarcerated in prisons. So when we talk about pathways to incarceration, domestic violence is a pathway that is very common for women. The studies that have looked at this have shown that anywhere between around 80% of women who are incarcerated have experienced some form of domestic violence, whether it's intimate partner violence or childhood sexual abuse. Men also experience trauma for sure, but domestic violence is a far more prevalent issue among women who are incarcerated than for men. Economic marginalization is also a major cause of incarceration for both men and women, but the marginalization of women economically is particularly extreme. And then women are also more likely to have mental health and substance use issues, particularly PTSD is especially common among women, in large part, not surprisingly, because of the trauma women who are incarcerated have experienced prior to their incarceration. When we look inside prisons and jails, the experiences of women are also unique. They have access to way fewer programs than men. So for instance, in Texas, women who are incarcerated have 2 job certification programs, men have 21. Pregnant women are treated horribly behind bars. They're often shackled while they're pregnant. They have horrible prenatal care. A study by I believe it's the Rebecca Center, found that I think the state with the best prenatal care, they only gave it a grade of a B, and most states were in the D or F range. Women are also disproportionately likely to be sexually assaulted by correctional staff. So 7% of state and federal prison population is women, 13% in jails are women, but women make up 33% and 60% of instances of sexual victimization by correctional staff. And then last, the reentry issues that women face are unique and extreme. So family reunification is a huge issue. 50% of women were the primary caretakers of minor-age children before they were incarcerated, and more than 10% lose their children while they're incarcerated to foster care. Housing instability is particularly extreme for formerly incarcerated women. Formerly incarcerated women have homelessness rates that are 35% higher than formerly incarcerated men. They also have higher rates of economic marginalization. They're much less likely to be employed, and when they are employed, they're much less likely to have full-time work. And the fact that they have such high rates of mental health and substance use issues going in, and that they experience continued trauma while behind bars, makes the lack of access to healthcare that formerly incarcerated people often experience very problematic for women. All right, so now that's sort of, that was my attempt to motivate us to think that it's really important to focus on women's incarceration. Now I'm going to move into a study that looked at the effects of California's reforms, which I'm going to now provide some background on. So California is often viewed as sort of the model for reforming the criminal justice system or criminal legal system. Starting in 2009, they started embarking on these reforms, and these reforms have targeted nonviolent offenses. So they haven't focused on violence primarily, and they've aimed to reduce parole and parole revocations and probation, they've shifted punishments to counties. So rather than incarcerate people in prisons, they've sometimes moved people to jails or to diversion programs. They've reclassified many felony drug and property offenses and made them misdemeanors instead of felonies. And now the third strike has to be serious or violent. It can't be a nonviolent offense, and it's applied to both new offenses and retroactively. So people are able to reapply to be resentenced. So prior to this study, there was limited quasi-experimental research examining the effects of these reforms, and the research that did exist focused on the impact on recidivism, which is an important question, but not the question I was interested in. Moving beyond quasi-experimental work, descriptive studies have shown that incarceration rates have gone down since the reforms have been enacted, but there's a lot of limitations in this work. So the research focusing on incarceration rates hadn't included a control group. It rarely looked at prisons and jail together, which is a particularly important issue for women given how common jail incarceration is for them. It has also not directly examined racial and gender disparities. And lastly, this research had largely focused on one reform rather than looking at the forms collectively, which I argue is the better approach given that the reforms came soon after one another, so it'd be hard to isolate the effects of each individually, and also they tended to focus on very similar issues and nonviolent offenses. So the research questions that my colleagues and I sought to answer were what has been the causal impact of these reforms on the total incarceration rate, which is the prison and jail incarceration rate combined, disparities in incarceration between men and women, and the Black, white, and Latinx-White total incarceration rate disparities. So my hypotheses were that these reforms would reduce the total incarceration rate because a substantial share of people are incarcerated for nonviolent offenses. I also expected that male-female disparities would actually increase because women are less likely than men to be incarcerated for violent offenses. And then third, I expected that Black, white, and Latinx-White disparities would either increase or at the very least not decline. One, because of bias and how reforms were likely to be implemented and who would be subject to these changes in sentencing. And then two, because of structural issues and tons of discrimination, it is true that if you look at what people are incarcerated for behind bar, people of color do have higher rates of incarceration for violent offenses than white people. So those were the reasons why I expected these reforms targeting nonviolent offenses to exacerbate racial and ethnic disparities. So the data and methods of the study. So to conduct the analyses, I created a panel data set that captures total prison and jail incarceration rates at the state level from 2000 to 2015. I used data from the Bureau Incarceration Trends data set, which for people who are interested in this topic, I recommend you look at, you look into. It's publicly available. It has data also at the county level, and it's one of the few sources that captures both prison and jail incarceration. And then I used US Census Bureau data to adjust for population size, so I could capture rates. The key measures were the total incarceration rate, which is the total number of people in prison and jail per 100,000 population. The male-female incarceration ratio, which is the total male incarceration rate divided by the total female incarceration rate. The Black-white incarceration ratio, which is the total Black incarceration rate, and divided by the total white incarceration rate. And then the same thing for Latinx-white incarceration, the total Latinx incarceration rate divided by the total white incarceration rate. You'll notice here that the analyses weren't intersectional, and I'll get into why later in the talk, but that is certainly a limitation. So how do I analyze the data? I used a synthetic control approach where I matched California to a weighted combination of states that most closely resembled California in pre-incarceration trends. So just for instance, what this looks like for the total incarceration rate analysis, the control group was Alabama, which made up about 5% of the control group. Alaska made up about 2% of the control group. Indiana, about 5%. New Hampshire, about 17%. Ohio, about 5%. Rhode Island, about 23%. And Texas, 43%. Using this approach, statistical significance is not calculated in kind of the same way that it is in regression approaches. So I use what's called the placebo in space approach, where California is the treated group. So we would think that the effects would be larger in California than in other states. So what I did was for each other state, I created their own synthetic control at the same time period. And I'd see how they performed compared to their synthetic control after the reforms began, which the first year was 2010 here. And basically then, if California had larger effects than all but at least 5% of the other states, we would treat that as a statistically significant finding. And I use this approach instead of difference in difference because it ensures the parallel trend assumption is more closely matched. So by using a weighted combination of states, this weighted combination of states creates a closer pre-incarceration match than any one state or any set of states that aren't matched. All right, so now looking at the results. So real briefly, some descriptive findings. So over the course of the study period, the United States' total incarceration rate was 629 per 100,000, or basically 630. California's was very similar to that, about 636 per 100,000. If you look at the disparities between men and women, the United States was about 10.5. California was slightly higher, 11.25. When we look at Black-white disparities, the Black incarceration rate was about 6.39 times higher than the white incarceration rate in the US, about 6.88 times higher in California than the US. And when we look at the Latinx-White ratio, it was slightly less in California, 1.77 times higher for the Latinx population in the US compared to 1.67 times higher in California. This just gives you some background on incarceration rates, how they compare in California to the US, but isn't particularly informative for the questions because it doesn't divide things up pre and post reform, right? So that's what I do next. So this chart shows the total incarceration rates in California, which is the treated unit. It's the solid line in this chart, compared to the synthetic control unit, which is the dotted line in this chart. What this chart shows is that prior to 2010, which is really when the first reform in California went into effect, you can see that the solid line and the dotted line are pretty much on top of one another. They very closely match. Starting in 2010, you see that California's incarceration rate declines pretty dramatically, and that it declined to a greater extent than its synthetic control unit. In fact, it declined by about 80 per 100,000 persons more by 2015 than its synthetic control. So the way I interpret this is that California's reforms are associated with an 80 per 100,000 reduction in the incarceration rate overall, which is roughly about a fifth of the incarceration rate that it started at prior to the reforms. So pretty, or maybe actually a sixth or seventh. So pretty dramatic reduction. Next slide. So when we look at the effect on men and women, the male-female ratio in total incarceration, again, we see prior to the reforms, the treated unit and the synthetic control unit are pretty similar. We see starting in 2010 that the ratio between male and female incarceration rate increases. In California, it actually declines in the synthetic control unit. And in short, even though prior to the reforms, the ratios were basically identical between California and the synthetic control, by 2015, the incarceration rate ratio was 20% higher in California than in the synthetic control. which suggested that gender disparities increased more in California, or that these reforms were responsible for an increase in gender disparities in California. Then looking at racial disparities, first looking at Black-white disparities. What you see here again, the synthetic control unit does closely match California prior to the reforms. After the reforms, the Black-white ratio in California, there's some blips here and there, but it basically stays about the same. Maybe it declines slightly. But there's a much more dramatic decline in the synthetic control unit over time, which again suggests that California's reforms led to an increased the Black-white disparities in incarceration, because our assumption would be that they would have followed the path the synthetic control unit would have followed had they not experienced the reforms. So, and these disparities are quite large. So the Black-white ratio was about 43% higher in California than the synthetic control unit by 2015. So that's a pretty large difference in magnitude, considering that they started basically at the same disparity level prior to the reforms. And then the last result looks at the Latinx-White ratio in total incarceration. And here we see the same general pattern where prior to the reforms, the treated and synthetic control units are quite similar. After the reforms, it takes a year or so, but after the reforms go into effect, the Latinx-White ratio in California remains the same, basically. It doesn't really go up or down too dramatically, but it declines dramatically or pretty substantially in the synthetic control unit. So by the end of the period in 2015, the Latinx-White ratio is approximately 25% higher in California than it is. Oh, am I having an issue with my video? Oh. The Latinx-White ratio is approximately 25% higher in California post-reform than it is in its synthetic control. So these findings were robust to a wide number of robustness checks. So the first thing I did was, you might be wondering, is one state in the synthetic control sort of responsible driving all these findings, since some states were weighted more than others? So I conducted each analysis dropping one state. So for instance, if we were to look back at the prior example where I believe Texas, Indiana, Ohio, and some other states were made up to synthetic control, I'd run the analysis dropping Texas, then I'd run the analysis dropping Indiana, then I'd run the analysis dropping Ohio, and I do that for each state in synthetic control unit, and the result held. I also ran analyses separate for prison and jail incarceration rates, and the results were different for prison and jail incarceration rates, but in a way that makes sense. So the results were driven almost entirely by declines in prison incarceration, which makes sense given that California's reforms in some cases actually moved people from prisons to jails and focused on reducing prison incarceration, largely because they had an overcrowding issue and were mandated to by a court, but did not have a jail incarceration overcrowding issue. So the fact that these findings were driven by changes in prison incarceration, not jail incarceration, to me is suggestive that the analyses are, that the results are accurate, or at least are telling a true story. And then I also ran analyses separately for each gender and racial group. And this is less of a robustness check, which is more of an important analysis to determine what's actually going on. So I want to be clear, when evaluating California's findings or California's reforms, the findings suggest that California's reforms benefited all groups. They just benefited women more than men, and they benefited white people more than Black and Latinx people. So incarceration rates for Black and Latinx people did go down as a result of the reforms, just proportionally less so than they did for white people. And the same is true for men relative to women, right? So kind of when we're thinking about the implications of these reforms, it's not necessarily that they're all bad because they don't address disparities or they affect some groups more so than others. They tended to benefit everyone. It's just they benefit some people more than others, right? So when we think about implications for public policy, I think one thing that's really critical is that if we take a race-neutral lens, which is what California's reforms did, there was no explicit aim to reduce racial disparities. Their goal was primarily to make prisons less crowded because they were court ordered to do so. And if you do that, if you take a race-neutral lens and you focus explicitly on nonviolent offenses and don't address or over-incarceration for violent offenses, you're likely to reduce incarceration overall. You're likely to reduce women's incarceration to a greater extent than men, but you're unlikely to substantially address racial disparities, racial and ethnic disparities. To do so, you're gonna have to make that a primary aim, and you're gonna have to reckon with how we punish violence, which is something that very few reforms have even really considered. So there has been a lot of emphasis on criminal legal reform lately, and we've seen incarceration rates have declined a little bit. So I showed that earlier chart where our incarceration rate was about 707 per 100,000, and now it's down to about 650 per 100,000. And that's an improvement. We're still the world leader. We still incarcerate violence in a different way than other places. And we can still make reductions by focusing on nonviolent offenses, but that's really all we've done so far. And we're not gonna become like the rest of the world unless we start addressing violence, which is not, I feel like it's not often talked about enough in kind of criminal legal reform, at least in the popular discussions, but it's something we need to think about. So as I mentioned, when talking about my analyses, there are some really important data limitations that I think are really critical to think about. So all data sources that I'm aware of really only capture point in time estimates rather than like the number of people who are impacted over the course of a year, for instance. And this is really important when we think about jails. So jails, people often go in and out of jails. So there are, I believe, maybe 10 or 11 million people that enter jail every year because they capture really short stays. So if we just capture a point in time estimate, we're really missing a lot of the people who are potentially impacted by the criminal legal system. And this is really critical because women's incarceration is disproportionately tied up in jails, right? So when we're thinking about women, the fact that we're only capturing these point in time estimates is critical. Relatedly, there's no annual national jail data, at least to my knowledge, that captures intersectionality by state or county, even by gender and race, for instance, let alone things like sexuality and gender identity. So that's a real limitation. The VERA data that I used, it had the rates separately, so I couldn't do intersectional analysis. I couldn't look at what the effects were for Black women. For instance, I could only look at what the effects were for Black people and women separately. National prison data does a little better job. It captures race and gender, but does not capture sexual or gender identity, as well as other things that might be of interest. And then when we think more broadly, our criminal legal system traps people in ways other than just incarcerating them. We have roughly, I think, 5 million people who are currently under community supervision, 1 million of whom are women or so. And this data on probation and parole also suffers limitations around intersectionality. So why does this matter? So one reason is that there remain large disparities in incarceration by race ethnicity. Although for women's incarceration, the disparities are not quite as great as they are for men by race ethnicity, and they've narrowed pretty dramatically, but we still see a situation where Black women are incarcerated at twice the rate of white women. We also know that reentry challenges are more severe for women of color. So with respect to housing instability, for Black women, homelessness rates for women who are returning from prison or jail are almost 60% higher than for white women. And then the economic marginalization is more severe for Black and Latinx women. So their unemployment rates are nearly twice as large, for instance, as they are for white women who are returning home. So the challenges that women of color face when they return home, while they're great for white women too, they're even more extreme for women of color. And then when we think about disparities by sexual and gender identity, 33% of women in jails and 26% of women in prison identify as LGBTQ, which is higher than in the general population. And then when we think about the transgender population, 21% of transgender women experience, according to a survey, because the actual data sources where people are incarcerated do not capture this information, but according to a survey of transgender women, 21% experienced incarceration during their lifetime. So more than 1 in 5. And there's also substantial variation by race. If you're a Black transgender woman, about 1 in 2, you've got about a 50% chance of experiencing incarceration during your lifetime, right? So when we start thinking intersectionally by race and gender, we see really dramatic disparities. That Black transgender female figure or woman figure of 47% is quite similar to the likelihood that if you're a Black man who dropped out of high school, that you'll experience incarceration. So just to put that in context, right? It's a little more than 50% for Black men who have dropped out of high school. And just being Black, transgender, and woman, your rate is almost 1 in 2. It's almost 50%. So it's super high. And then when you look at how you're treated behind bars, if you're a transgender woman, nobody's treated well in prisons and jails, but transgender women are treated particularly poorly. So if you look at men in prison, about 4.4% have reported experienced sexual misconduct, compared to nearly 60% of transgender women who are housed in men's facilities. So if you're a transgender woman housed in a men's facility in men's prisons, you're more than likely, statistically, to experience sexual misconduct. Relatedly, transgender women are often, this is more anecdotally, but it's the experience that's been regularly reported, that transgender women are often put in solitary for their own protection, in quotes. And we know what the implications for mental health are and how cruel solitary confinement is. So the fact that we have no data or very limited data being collected on intersectionality, both by race and gender, and these are only 2 areas where intersectionality exists, there are other things to think about too, is a real limitation given the different likelihoods of actually getting incarcerated depending on kind of your identity, as well as how you're treated once you're there when you return home. So just to sum up, women are an important part of mass incarceration, and we should think about them in this. We shouldn't neglect them. It's important to think about men too, but women often really go under the radar in this story, and we stand out just as much in our incarceration of women compared to the rest of the world as we do in our incarceration of men. When we look at California's reforms, which appear to be a model, or at least which are often viewed as a model, it's clear that they reduced incarceration, which is great, that they reduced incarceration for all the groups that we are able to track, but that they benefited women more than men, and that they failed to address racial disparities and perhaps even increased racial disparities. And then last, I want to argue that the lack of intersectional data is a big limitation and leaves many questions unanswered. So for instance, in the prior study, while racial disparities increased overall, were there gender differences in the impact on racial disparities? So for instance, did racial disparities impact more for men than women or less? That would be something we'd want to know. And then what were the implications among women across gender identity and sexuality? And do those vary by race, right? So those are things we'd really want to know. But that we can't answer, unfortunately, at this time. So that's all I have. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate the invitation, and I look forward to any questions people might have.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Professor Gottlieb. This is really important and amazing work you're doing, and I'm so glad you were able to share it with us today. I'm going to pass it to Katie for questions, but before I do that, I do have a question I wanted to start with. And I was wondering if you could talk more about the difficulties of obtaining data on the criminal legal system. Like I know there was a recent report from the Harvard Law School on racial disparities in the Massachusetts criminal system. They were given access to some criminal data, but they mentioned that accessing and collecting that data can be really challenging for researchers, and I'm sure even more challenging when you're doing intersectional work as well. So I was wondering if you talk a little more about that.
Yeah, it's a huge issue just in general. It's even an issue with crime data too. So it's not just even we collect, it's just the data that's collected is really poor. But part of the issue is there are so many criminal legal systems. So I think like we think about it perhaps as one system, the United States, but really every county has its own criminal legal system, every state has its own system. So there are real barriers and each system keeps different data and has different willingness to share data. It's very hard to get, one reason why you don't see as much work around people who are incarcerated is because the ability to actually have prison facilities share that information is really limited. And there are also, even if you can get access to data, there are understandably so real IRB implications as well, challenges as well, because people in prison are a protected group, and rightfully so. They've been horribly mistreated in research, but it still makes doing research that impacts people who are in prison much more daunting as a researcher, because there are just a lot of hoops to jump through. But yeah, I'd say a lot of the issues come down to people don't want to share information that might make them look bad as part of it. They're not really required, or there aren't necessarily consequences for not sharing information or collecting information. And just when you have so many systems, it's hard to get everyone on the same page. So like, at least those are kind of the issues I see with data collection. And then when you start looking at things like policing, it becomes even harder to do that. So when you look at data, for instance, on police misconduct, the best data is collected by media sources and crowdsourcing people who are just looking at media stories to see who was killed by police. Police might have this information, but don't share it, right? So I think kind of the interest of people at play and how sharing data isn't necessarily in their interest plays a big role in why it's hard to get data.
Great, thank you so much. And I'll pass it to Katie to facilitate the rest of our Q&A.
Awesome, thank you so much for kicking us off, Anisha. I really appreciate that thoughtful question. I see Iris has her hand raised to ask a question, but before that, I just wanted to sort of piggyback off of Anisha's point around data collection and how the majority of trans women incarcerated in the US are incarcerated in men's prisons, which means that every CO officer they encounter, basically, the majority of them are men. And that when we talk about sexual assault of incarcerated people, that strip searches are something that happen on the regular to people incarcerated in the US. And I'm curious about, and I'm not sure there's an answer to this question, but if those women are reporting every time they're strip searched, when they have a visitor, when they go to work, when there's anything like that happening, if those are counted as sexual assaults, because on the outside world, they would be. And I think there's a lot of times that we don't count the violence that happens to incarcerated people as violence when it would count as violence in the free world.
Yeah, 100% true. And these data almost definitely do not count that, would be my instinct. And that we are certainly undercounting mistreatment, and sexual assault is just the tip of the iceberg. The dehumanization more generally is just staggering. So I've had the opportunity to work with people in prison on their parole applications. I've had the opportunity to teach in a prison, and just people in prison are often not treated like they are actually people. And that's like the sexual assault is devastating, but so is that dehumanization that exists. And even for the family members of people who are coming or people who are visiting, you're treated horribly. You're also searched, especially if you're a woman, you have to like take off your bra. And everything you wear goes off in the machine and you have to kind of figure out like what's going on, and they may not let you see the person for hours. So this whole system is just designed to break people down. And you're 100% right that the data, we need to do a better job collecting data, but also data, it's impossible for data to totally capture the dehumanization that exists. It can only do so much because there is just such a great, the dehumanization is just so extreme.
Thanks for that. All right, Iris, I'm gonna unmute you now.
Thank you so much, Erin, for this incredibly important work and for your rigor in analyzing the data. My question is related to the mechanisms that you mentioned at the beginning. That there could be two different mechanisms leading to the results that you find, and probably both are important. And I presume your data doesn't allow you to distinguish between the two of them, but I just still want to pose the question, right? The two mechanisms that you highlighted were, one, that the distribution of violence is different for men and women and for people of color and white people. The second mechanism is that the system is biased, and that could, of course, affect the first hypothesis as well.
Yes.
But it also, your primary argument was it could also affect, of course, the second, the mechanism now, the implementation of the policy. For policy, that's of course a hugely relevant question. And do you have any sense of whether we find the gender gaps and race gaps is due to the fact that we start out with different distributions in those populations, or due to the fact that there is bias at that stage in the implementation of the policy?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one I wish I could answer rigorously and empirically. But my best guess, based on other work, just looking at questions related to bias in implementation, or bias at least in how people are sentenced more generally, is that it's both. And how to sort of carve that out and determine what percent is what, that I can't really, I don't want to speculate. But certainly we know from studies from other people, from other studies I've done, that there is bias, even once you account for criminal history or any other sort of thing that we might think is legitimate reason for bias, which you could argue whether criminal history is a legitimate reason for harsher sentencing, but even assuming that it is, you still see racial and ethnic disparities in how people are treated, both in terms of whether they're incarcerated pre-trial, based on whether they're sentenced to incarceration, based on how long they're sentenced to. As Anna's saying in the chat, violence, and I tried to highlight this, but maybe did not do a good enough job. What we define as violence is not necessarily violence, and people sometimes they may have committed a violent act and then but they're sentenced for something that's non-violent. So like this violent, non-violent dichotomy is challenging, and it's not one I generally like to use because it also stigmatizes the people who might have been incarcerated for a violent offense, but maybe they were a victim of domestic violence, or that led to that, or they've had all these other structural barriers that you pointed to, Iris, about like how this bias could lead to greater violence too. So I didn't focus on that, but it almost 100% does, right? Like the distribution of violence is driven by a lot of policy decisions we have made throughout history and now. So I mean, I think when we think about how to address this, we certainly need to address the bias that occurs at the system level, which I'm sure is part of the story, like once people are being sentenced. But we also need to think about how we allocate resources. We need to invest in communities that are marginalized way before people actually experience incarceration. So I think those are two different policy solutions, but I think we should be thinking about both of them. And they're both really critical.
Thank you so much, Iris. All right, Allison, I see that you have a hand raised. I'm going to ask you to start your video if you're comfortable with that too. It'll allow us to spotlight you so that we can see you. But if not, no worries, just unmute yourself.
Hi there. Thank you so much for this really excellent presentation. I just had a question for you about the control, the way that you created the control, because all of the particularly policy implications rely on that difference between the control and California. So you mentioned that there were pre-incarceration trends. I wonder if you could just talk more about those, and also was California unusual in having the only of those, there were no control states in which there was some kind of policy change during that time?
So that's a really good question. So first, when you look at the prior trends, that is really critical, right? So when I'm looking at trying to compare California to something else, if California was operating on a completely different trend prior to the reforms might not be driving any future trends. They could be driven by those prior trends. So that's what the matching was about. But with your point about other reforms, that's a great point. And I think it's something that there are so many small reforms that occur across the country. So it's not something I could capture, but I would argue that at least for some of the analyses, it actually leads to kind of a more conservative estimate of what we're finding, because there are other places that made changes during this period. The fact that what we're seeing in California, even though some of the places that are likely in the control also made some reforms, suggests that maybe the results potentially would be stronger if we were able to capture that. With that said, we can't know that for sure. So that is certainly a limitation, because yeah, there are just a lot of reforms and it's difficult to capture, but that is a really good point.
Thank you so much. All right, Sochi.
Thank you so much. Great presentation, Erin. So I have a question in regard to the population that is incarcerated most in California in terms of the reforms. So if I'm not mistaken, California incarcerates the Latinx community at a much higher rate than other parts of the country. Like they make up a bigger portion of their population. If that's the fact, which I believe that it is, would it be fair to say that their reform effort or the reform lens should have been really focused on the Latinx community, and in particular the undocumented community, which probably makes up a big portion of that of those numbers?
Yeah, so I think that the reform should certainly target the Latinx and Black community. So part of the reason you see like more Latinx people incarcerated in California is because there are just more Latinx people in California. So that's part of it. But even when we adjust for population size, we still see that the reforms exacerbated disparities. One thing about the issue around documentation that I would kind of point out is that when people are incarcerated for offenses that are related specifically to their documentation, they're held in federal facilities, which isn't captured here. So, and I think that's actually the correct way to look at this, because there's no reason why California's specific reforms would affect the aggressiveness at which ICE rounds up people who are undocumented. But I do think that is one area that I didn't talk about in terms of intersectionality that is critical and would be something to look at. So I think I agree wholeheartedly that reforms need to think about how to reduce disparities across both race and ethnicity, and looking at the Latinx community too. I wanted to also just real quick point at Allison's point about Texas. And I agree, Texas would be important to look at. And they did have some reforms. What I would say that gives me a little more confidence that in the results is that the analysis held even when Texas was dropped, right? So one of the robustness checks was dropping each individual state in the control group, in the synthetic control group. And even after dropping Texas, which made up 43% of the control group, the results held. And actually, those robustness checks, there's a really long appendix to this article if you want to look at all the robustness checks. That's about 70 pages that has all those kind of things with different states dropped. If you're curious, I'd be happy to share it. Sorry, Sochi, did I answer your question? Okay.
Great, thank you so much, Sochi. And does anyone else have any questions? If not, great. I'd like to, before we wrap up, Erin, just ask you, before we close, is there anything that you would like to talk about that you did not get to talk about today that you think that we should know?
That's a great question, and one I wasn't prepared for. Well, I think I just want to, it's not something I haven't said, but I think that women are often invisible in kind of the criminal legal discussion. They're often people doing the organizing, but they're invisible in sort of a lot of the demands, and women of color in particular. And I think the only reason we're at a point where it's being talked about at all is because formerly incarcerated women and currently incarcerated women are leading this work. So I think I just want to encourage, and I think this is preaching to the choir here, but that we try to make the experiences of women with criminal legal contact more visible, and that we prioritize them as well. And this is particularly, I think, true at the intersection of intimate partner violence, where what we've seen, and my wife, if she were here, which I wish she were, but she couldn't make it, would be able to talk about better. But really, like, intimate partner violence agencies get a good amount of funding, maybe not enough, but they often don't really want to work with justice-involved women. Like, their services are often directly geared to explicitly, like, if you have a record, you may not be able to get services. So I think I would love to see intimate partner violence agencies and criminal legal reform groups really work to make sure that everyone's included, right? So I think, like, this is, yeah, women who are incarcerated are among the most marginalized people in our country, and we need to focus on them. So that's sort of my my plea.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Erin, and really appreciate you sharing your important research with our community as well. I also want to acknowledge folks are posting in the chat as well, but there are people on this call who also organize with and for incarcerated folks in Massachusetts and beyond. So really excited you were able to be here with us today, and feel free to keep sharing those resources in the chat as well before we close out.